Hello and welcome back to the Reapers. Now I've been waiting to do this video for absolutely ages, probably over a year, and I've just never found the context to do it where it would have some kind of, entertainment value and it wouldn't just be an old ill man talking for hours on end. And so what I've got here is I've labelled the video the importance of angle of attack in a dogfight, and that is absolutely true. That's the selling point of this video, if you like. But what we are talking about is a bit bigger than that. We're talking about the importance of an angle of attack and its relationship to speed. These two are intertwined, they're inversely proportional to each other. And how these two are also linked to the other forces on an aircraft: thrust, drag, weight and lift, and where those other forces come from. To understand one of these, we really need to understand all of them. But the primary end product that we're looking at here is our ability and understanding of angle of attack and how we have to manage it to be able to perform a dogfight. And it's not just a dogfight, it's anything in controlling an aircraft that requires this understanding. Takeoff, landing, just basic non-combat maneuvers, refueling, literally just about everything in an aircraft needs an understanding of angle of attack and its relationship to speed and the other forces. So first of all, the scope of this video. It's possible to look at this in a very complex way, but we're going to keep it really simple. In some ways, it's going to be overly simplified, and I'm sure that will annoy many people, but that's just the way I want to do it. Otherwise, it will literally become hours long. And who I'm aiming at this at is beginners in sims. So whether that's DCS World or your X-Plane or your Microsoft or whatever, all of the sims require the same understanding to operate the aircraft properly. So the reason that I'm making this video is when I started flight sims, and that would have been X-Plane, about a year before I found DCS, I started in X-Plane, and the first things I did in X-Plane is I downloaded a bunch of jet fighters, because that's obviously what I'm interested in, F-16s, F-15s and whatnot, and flew in and did my best to try and dogfight stuff in X-Plane, which is difficult because it's not designed for that, obviously. And I wanted to be like Maverick in Top Gun. I wanted to be doing cool dogfights and turn fights and vertical turn fights and whatnot. So I would get in there, I would yank back on the stick as hard as I could because I thought that's how you drove an aeroplane. And it would never work. The aeroplane would just stall every time and I would end up plummeting out of the sky. And I didn't know why. I thought it was like an arcade game, like you would get in an arcade or on a Nintendo or something, or War Thunder or whatever. And that's because I didn't have this basic understanding of the relationship of angle of attack and speed and the other forces. Once you've got the very basic idea of how they interact with each other, then suddenly everything makes sense and you can fly properly. So like I said, if you're not a beginner, this video will probably have no use for you at all. You'll probably know it all already and probably know more. But it's very important for beginners to understand this stuff. And once you've got a good understanding of it, you will be able to immediately fly 10 times better in just about every sphere of flying: fighting, landing, taking off, formation flying, just about everything. So we've got various examples here. Credit goes to just various people on the internet. I found these images shared all over the internet, so I don't know where they come from, and I've just adjusted them where they need to be adjusted. So the first thing, and there's no particularly logical format here, we're going to bounce about the screen as we discuss. First thing we want to know is, of course, what is angle of attack? So we've got this diagram here, angle of attack, and showing an ADI, showing an artificial horizon as well. So we've got our aeroplane here. This line here is the longitudinal axis of the aircraft, otherwise known as the datum line. So all that means is if we draw a line from the tail of the aircraft to the nose of the aircraft and extrude that through. So this is where the aircraft is pointing. Now this line here is where the aircraft is actually flying. Now this here almost never intercepts with this here. It's almost always different, usually above, like we've got shown here. And the angle of attack is the difference of the angle between this line here and this line here. And the reason why you have angle of attack is because all aircraft need angle of attack to fly. And it took me a while to get my head around this because I came from cars. Cars don't have angle of attack. Angle of attack of cars or motorbikes is always 0 because they only have a single plane that they drive on. An aircraft has an extra plane. It has elevation, altitude, and it doesn't have constant direct contact with a plane or a surface like a car, and so we have this kind of vertical slip angle known as the angle of attack. So this angle of attack is always present, and it's something that needs to be always monitored. Now, once you've been flying for a while and you understand it, then you don't really need to see a gauge. You just know by the feel of your aircraft what your angle of attack is, but you always have to understand it. Now, in this case, we've got this aircraft here, and it's climbing at about 10 degrees. This is its actual travel angle here. And this is the Earth in relation, the horizon, if you like. So you can see the aircraft is climbing here by about 10 degrees, but it's pointing up at about 20 degrees. So in this angle of attack here is about 10 degrees. And you can see the wind flow, which is very important. We're assuming that there's no actual atmospheric wind on today. Everything, in all of these cases, the atmospheric wind is 0. But because our aircraft is moving at a velocity, at a speed, then that wind vector is coming along this line here, the vector of travel, backwards, obviously, at the same speed that the aircraft is traveling. So that is what we call the wind flow. So to get the terminology properly, this here is the flight path angle, and this here is the pitch attitude. So if we look up here on our artificial horizon, you can see that we've got this guy here. This is known as our flight path vector. This little guy is showing us where we're actually flying, the flight path angle in this case. And this guy here is the pitch attitude. This is telling us how far up in angle our aircraft is pointing. So we're pointing up at 20 degrees, we're flying up at 10 degrees, and our angle of attack, as it says, is the difference between these two at 10 degrees. So the next thing we're going to say is that our angle of attack, otherwise known as alpha, is related to speed. We can say that they are, if we look down here, they are inversely proportional. So as speed goes up, the alpha, or the angle of attack, decreases. As the angle of attack goes up, the speed decreases. And that's true in just about every case of flying. So next we're going to relate our angle of attack to the other forces of our aircraft. So we've got a diagram here. Again, we've got a jet and it's climbing at about 10 degrees. So let's just look at the symbology. So it's moving along this line here. Here is our flight path. Here is our longitudinal axis or datum line, and the difference here is A alpha, which let's just say for sake of argument again is 10 degrees. We've got our vertical axis and our horizontal axis. This is purely for reference. This is not related to any forces. So we can see this is the Earth horizontal and this is the plumb of gravity. So the first force we apply to the aircraft is weight, and the weight is a force. And a force is F equals ma. Force equals mass times acceleration. In terms of mass, that's very important. So an aircraft that's heavy, let's say our F-15 in this case, if it's light, then it's got no ordnance and not much fuel. If it's heavy, then it's got high fuel and full ordnance. Gives it a much higher mass. And then we applied to that mass the acceleration, which is the gravity, 1g of Earth's gravity. So on this planet, 1g is, I think it's 9.8 meters per second squared. So we times 9.8 times the mass of the aircraft. That gives us a force, and that is our weight. And that is always referenced to plumb down towards the center of the Earth. Obviously, that's how gravity works. So we've got this massive force pulling us plumb down based on our mass. So we have to balance that out with a force going upwards, which is going to be our lift force. We'll look at how we create lift in a bit, but essentially we look at creating lift by forcing the aircraft forward at a speed, and using pressure differentials we can create lift. Now I've never been quite sure if lift is the actual vector shown here or if lift is directly up opposite to weight. If anyone knows that, please let me know. That's something that's always confused me. And for our aircraft to fly to level, then lift force has to be equal to weight force, and if it's to climb, then the lift force has to be more than the weight force, and so on. So to get our aircraft to go at speed, we have to give it a thrust force. This is a force that is pushing this way down the longitudinal axis of the aircraft. Take a note here that it's not pushing at the flight path, it's pushing at the longitudinal axis. Thrust is obviously, you know, it's caused by engines, either a jet engine or a propeller engine, and in either case they work by forcing mass backwards. In the, you know, for a jet engine it's in terms of hot gas at a very high speed, and the counter reaction to that is our aircraft goes forward along the is pushed forward along the longitudinal axis here. In fact, technically I think you could say it's pulled forward, but we're not going to get too much into that today. And the only thing we want to pick up at this point is that the efficiency of that thrust force is dependent here on the alpha, on the angle of attack. So in this case, the angle of attack is very low. The vector of the thrust here is very close to the vector of the flight path. But imagine if we had a massive alpha, and it was traveling along this line here, but we were pointing, our thrust line was pointing up at this angle. It would be a very inefficient thrust vector in that case to actually push our aircraft along the flight path, and that's something we'll look at a little later. And what I mean by that is only a percentage of the thrust will actually be thrusting the aircraft along the current flight path. So thrust is what speeds the aircraft up, and of course, as you already know, drag is the opposite to thrust. As soon as we push something through air, as soon as you put your hand out of a car when you're moving at 70 miles an hour, then you get a huge drag force pulling it back. And that, for the sake of this video, is going to be the air resistance of pushing the aircraft through a fluid, the fluid being the air. In reality, drag is a combination of things, but let's just say air resistance to keep it simple. And these forces and the angle of attack and the speed are all linked together. So if you imagine these four forces here, plus angle of attack, plus speed, as 6 little bars in like a bar chart, all lined up to alongside each other. If I push one of those bars down, if I push alpha down, for instance, then the others will all change. If I push speed up, then the others will all change, and they all change in different ways in relation to each other. And it's important to know that they all change like that. You adjust one of them, you adjust all of them. For instance, if I increase our thrust, then we naturally increase our speed, but we also increase our lift, and then we also increase our drag, and then we also lower our angle of attack. But our weight is always remaining the same at the instant that we are looking at the aircraft. So the weight is going to be a uniform factor in this case. Now, another thing we should think at this point, again, because we're simplifying things, is that we're looking at the aircraft here in just one plane. In reality, an aircraft operates in multiple planes, in a 3D plane, but we're just looking at it in 2 dimensions at the moment. So this guy, we're looking at the plane that we're looking at it at. So the weight force pulling this aircraft down is going to be here, pulling it down towards the Earth's gravity. In this case here, we're looking from a top view. So this is a side view. This case here, we're looking from a top view, and this is a fighter jet in a turn fight. And although, of course, it still does have weight pulling it down to the ground, just as this guy does here, we're ignoring that because we're just looking at the 2 axes. And in this case, the main force that is essentially pulling it away from the center of the circle would be a centrifugal force. Whereas this guy here, because he's not turning, doesn't have any centrifugal force in the plane that we're talking about. So alpha and speed are inversely proportional. We've talked about that. When we change our alpha, our angle of attack, or our speed, then our lift is always changed, and consequently our drag is always changed. So this is what we're talking about, pushing the bars up and down. They all change each other. I've removed weight from this because the weight, like we said, is always constant in this plane of thinking. And I've removed the thrust because the thrust is always constant. Well, that's not true. Even if the thrust is always set to a certain level, and for simplification, ignoring the fact that jet engines make different amounts of thrust depending how fast they're moving through the air and how high they are, then just the fact that as our angle of attack here, our efficiency of our thrust in this plane here, in this flight path, does change. So changing the alpha in this example that we've got here, ignoring all of those other effects, like I said, the thrust along our flight path does change depending on the alpha, the efficiency of this vector as translated to this vector here. So what we could do is really put thrust in here as well. They are all linked and they all change when one of them changes. So as a pilot, what actual control do we have over our alpha, our speed, our lift, our drag, our effective thrust? Well, we've got very little. All we've got is the thrust here. I should have called that the throttle. I meant to put that throttle. You can, push your throttle lever forwards or backwards. And you've got your elevators, and that's all you've got. In reality, you've got your roll and your yaw as well, but that has little to no effect in this plane here and on angle of attack as a whole. So we're basically ignoring roll and yaw for today. So all we have is up and down elevators and our throttle. So there's very little control, but that is all the control we need with an understanding of how these guys interact. So today we're focusing on angle of attack, and in particular how easy it is to over alpha, to get in a position where the angle of attack increases too far, gets out of control, and we essentially depart flight. That's the most dangerous part of angle of attack, and we'll be doing a few examples. I'm sure you've done it if you've flown any plane. I think we might have said this already, but we'll go over it again. As the angle of attack increases, then the lift increases, generated by the wings. Now, in reality, you have body lift and things like that. Again, simplification, we're just saying only the wings make lift today. As angle of attack increases, the wings increase lift to a point, and we'll look at that in a bit. The effective thrust decreases, so the effective thrust in our plane of flight here decreases because of the vector difference, as we've shown before. The drag increases because of the presentation of more surface area to the wind flow, which we'll go and have a look at a minute, and consequently the speed will decrease. And this little box of information here basically explains everything we need to know, to be honest. This is why you can get an over alpha, because as you pull alpha, your lift increases, which is great, well, up to a point. But the problem is your effective thrust decreases, your drag increases, and your speed decreases. So that happens. And it doesn't happen in a linear fashion that's nice and predictable. If I was drawing a nice linear line graph like this, it would be easy to predict. But it happens in a more like an exponential manner, where it slowly builds up, and then suddenly goes really fast like that, by which time it's too late. So you have to be spotting the alpha increase before it gets too late, because once you get to that point, as you'll see later on in the example, you can't save it. So we're going to backtrack and have a little look at the wings, how they interact at different angles of attack, and why we get this effect here. So first of all, we're looking at the lift created from an airfoil. So in our aircraft that we're looking at today, the lift is created purely from the wing. So we've got our wing here, and the cross section through a wing is called an airfoil. It's a certain shape that controls the air that it can give us a lovely net force called lift. To do that, we have to drive it through the air, assuming no atmospheric wind, as we said earlier, to create this process. So you can see that this airfoil here is tilted up. If we look at the chord of the airfoil from here to here, we can see that it's tilted up about 10 degrees. So we could say that's tilted up at an angle of attack of 10 degrees. And we just have to be a little bit careful about that, because when we're dealing with airfoils, we don't relate this as an angle of attack. We call it an angle of incidence, and it's usually different to the angle of attack of the aircraft. The wing is rarely mounted at in terms of chord here, perfectly along the longitudinal axis of the aircraft. It's usually tilted up a bit, depending on which aircraft we're looking at. But again, to keep everything super simple, we're just going to pretend that it is mounted along the longitudinal axis of the aircraft, and the aircraft is pointing up here at 10 degrees. And we know it's 10 degrees angle of attack because the airflow is coming from directly horizontal here. So that's the motion of the aircraft is exactly horizontal, where it's pointing up 10 degrees. And we can see as the aircraft comes and hits this airfoil, then it is manipulated around this wing. It has to go around the wing and then meet up with the air that's coming from below the wing here. And the manipulation of that air gives us a low pressure above the wing and a positive or high pressure above the wing. That doesn't sound very sexy or exciting, but in fact, pressure differentials like this can create absolutely enormous forces. So if we take the classic example, if you go to the toilet and you unreel a few squares of toilet paper, so they're dangling down from the reel, and you blow down one side of that dangling squares of toilet paper, then what happens? Well, the side that you're blowing the air along moves violently into the moving airflow. And the reason that's because we've created a pressure differential. When you speed up a fluid, and air is just a fluid, when you increase its velocity, you decrease its pressure. And so that area of low pressure that you've created alongside that toilet paper sucked it in. Or you could say, and I think a more accurate way of saying is that the higher pressure on the other side, the non-moving air side of the toilet paper, is pushing into the low area side. And we've got exactly the same thing here. Now, exactly how the velocity of the air relates to the low pressure, I don't know how airfoils that well. I always assumed that in this airfoil here, you force the air along a longer path here, and because it has to meet up with its counterpart at the end here, therefore it's going to go a longer distance, and therefore it has to go faster along the top of the airfoil. And as we know, faster means lower pressure, and because it has less distance to travel along the bottom here, then it goes slower and therefore a higher pressure. And that's an assumption I always made. I don't actually know if that's true with an airfoil, so you guys can let me know that, please. But that's my understanding of how an airfoil. I'm sure it's much more complicated than that in reality. But just that small difference in air pressure, like I said, can create a huge lift force here, and that force for a jumbo jet can be 200 tons or more than 200 tons, or whatever the weight of that plane is. not really relevant to this video, but just something, a cool little picture I found. Example of some airfoil designs. All aircraft have differing airfoil designs, or I should say that there are many airfoil designs out there, and aircraft pick different airfoil designs based on their objective. So we would have a typical subsonic big fat design here. I think these are exaggerated, but you get the idea. A transonic design, so just before Mach 1, and a multi-objective design here. And if we had a supersonic wing, then I think it would be very, very thin and almost hardly any airfoil on it. And in this case, the angle of incidence is shown kind of at 0, which is shown flat here. And a rough understanding, and again an assumption, I may be wrong, is that the subsonic designs are fatter because they need to create more deviance. Because the air is going at a lesser speed, they need to create a more extreme deviance in the air travel to create the same pressure differential, whereas a transonic design here that can go up to 650 knots or whatever, the air is going to be coming along a lot faster, so they need less effect on the airflow to create enough lift. Again, that's always been an assumption. I haven't read about airfoils, but let me know what you guys think on that. So let's jump over to airfoil and its relation to angle of attack, or I should say the angle of attack's effect on an airfoil. So if we start here on a typical angle of attack, remember what we said at the very beginning, an airplane to fly to create enough lift to overcome the weight has to be flying at a certain angle of attack, and that angle of attack has to be positive to create enough lift. So we've got a typical, I don't know, airliner or Cessna or whatever here, at an angle of attack of 4 degrees of this airfoil here. And you can see at whatever speed of airflow this is taken from, we create high pressure there, low pressure there, and all the way along the top of the airfoil here. And therefore what we get is this area here pushing that wing up into this low pressure air here. Then if we make it a more extreme, up to 10 degrees here, then we get even more area of high pressure increase here and a huge area of low pressure decrease up here. So we're creating at a high angle of attack, 10 degrees, even more lift on this wing airfoil. And if we go all the way back, remember, as alpha increases, lift increases. So that's showing how the lift will increase with the angle of attack on a given airfoil. This one's not really relevant today, but I just thought it looked quite cool. If you go down at a minus angle of attack, then you get negative, then you get a low pressure here, sucking it up, and a low pressure here, sucking it back down even further, and weirdly a high pressure there, pushing the front of the airfoil down there. So you get a net minus lift here. You get it pulling it down rather than up at this minus angle of attack. So that's something interesting. We go back to this comment here. Lift increases with alpha to a point. At some point, then the airflow of the airfoil breaks down, and suddenly our lift force disappears. This is, as you know, a stall. When a wing stalls, then the lift force pretty much disappears. Your aircraft falls out of the sky, and we'll probably have a little look at that later. And we've got a cool little thing here, so we can say critical angle of attack. So this is a normal angle of attack of, we've got 4 degrees here again. You can see the airflow is nice and snug and uniform. This airflow has to be constant and attractive like it is here, undisturbed, for these pressure differentials to be formed correctly. We increase it up to 10 degrees, and you can see we get an even more extreme effect and our increase in lift. Once we've hit the critical angle of attack here, and that will differ on what speed you're at, what airfoil you're at, and what angle to decide what is your critical angle of attack, then we get a complete breakdown in the upper area airflow. And once we get this breakdown, through reasons that way beyond me, we lose our negative pressure effect here, and there's nothing more to suck this wing up, and we lose the lift, and then the aircraft just becomes a stone. So this will happen when the aircraft gets too slow and or too high angle of attack. Remember, they are inversely proportional, so if the aircraft gets too slow, by virtue the alpha will get higher, assuming that we're on our constant flight path here, and vice versa. Okay, we can see excessive angle of attack, airflow is broken, no lift is to sustain the aircraft. So that shows us how lift is created in relation to the angle of attack. But there's actually another reason or the main reason I wanted to show these, is that as well as the difference on lift with changing angle of attack of a wing, the changing of the angle of attack also massively increases drag for the same speed. So in this case, let's think of our aircraft flying along at, I don't know, whatever, 400 knots, so 400 knots at 4 degrees angle of attack. It's presenting to the airflow a relatively small front section of wing. So remember, the air in these cases, all of these cases here, the aircraft is traveling, actually the flight path is straight and level. So the opposing air is coming in, it's hitting this wing, and it's got a relatively small amount of disturbance, whatever the thickness of that chord is, basically. Now imagine that the aircraft pitches up at 10 degrees. Now, looking at the air coming directly from the front, look at the size increase of the cross section of this wing. Absolutely massive. Now, we're just looking at the wing today, but if it's obviously in a fighter aircraft, you've also got the body to think about, which is in some ways even more of a bigger block, a drag creating entity than the wing. But we'll just stick to the wing for time being, for simplicity. So a small increase, that's a 6 degrees increase over that, has created 3 times as much cross-section area, and therefore 3 times, essentially, for simplicity, 3 times as much drag. And now imagine if we did an extreme increase in angle of attack, like a Puchev's Cobra or something, and we put this wing up at 90 degrees angle of attack, so full up here, then think of the extreme increase in drag as it's presenting the entire chord of that wing to the airflow, acting as a giant brake. And again here we're showing for the reason how an angle of attack can increase out of control to the point of no return, because as we're increasing the angle of attack by relatively small amounts, we're increasing our drag not linearly but more like exponentially. And as we said before, as well as our drag increasing, our effective thrust is increasing to our plane of motion, and all the time our speed is going to be decreasing because of the excess drag. So to our last diagram here, here's a top view, and we've got a turn fight. We've got this guy, a Hawk or C-101 or whatever it is, dogfighting another guy who's 180 degrees out of phase. We're in a turn fight at the moment. And in a turn fight, the first thing you want to do is you go max power, so the thrust along the longitudinal axis of the aircraft is pretty much constant, ignoring intake effects and other effects like that. But because the first thing we want to do is yank back on that stick, and we're going to load up the alpha on this aircraft, then you can see that we're about 40 degrees angle of attack extreme, near the critical angle of attack here of this aircraft. The thrust vector along here, compared to the aircraft's plane of motion, the flight path at this particular instance of this picture, which is opposite the wind here, is huge. That's about 40 degrees. So hugely inefficient thrust force to push the aircraft around this circle at the moment. I know it's slightly more complicated than that when we're dealing with a circle rather than a straight line of motion like this. But again, for simplicity's sake. And you can see as we ramp up that alpha again, as we explained up here, we're presenting a huge cross-sectional area of the aircraft to the instantaneous or brake wind flow here. And it's having to do all of this work to beat the centrifugal force here, which is the force that's pulling the aircraft around the circle away from the center of the circle. And this is the easiest case to get into what this video was all about at the beginning, which is getting the angle of attack out of control and essentially departing flight. So how do you stop the angle of attack getting out of control? Well, you just manage your angle of attack. If you've got an angle of attack meter in your aircraft, you may use that. But the reality is, unless you've got it up on your HUD, you very rarely get a chance to do that. In fact, even if it's on your HUD, you probably won't get a chance to do that in a dogfight or an extreme maneuver of some kind, because you're going to be looking straight up at your lift vector, which is this guy here. Well, your lift vector there, you see. So it really has to be done by feel and looking at your airspeed and knowing your thrust as a constant. So what we'll do next is we'll jump in an F-15, we'll call it an average fighter, shall we? And we'll put on the screen the information bar that tells us our angle of attack and our speed, which are the two things we're interested in. And basically we're going to simplify it and just imagine we just have the throttle, and we're going to be at full. To eliminate thrust, why don't we just put it at full throttle today completely, so that all we have is actual control is the elevator. That's the only control I'm going to be having when I'm having a mock dogfight, a mock lateral turn fight here. And I'm going to balance my angle of attack and keep it well below the runaway angle of attack. So at some point along this dogfight circle here, bearing in mind we've got more or less constant thrust, there is a balance point where the angle of attack, if we go any higher than that balance point, then the angle of attack will become runaway, and it will run all the way until you stall and depart flight. And the key during the extreme management of angle of attack, like it is here in a turn fight, is to know where that runaway angle of attack is in relation to our speed. So in this case, for an F-15 at about 350 knots, it's going to be about 15 degrees. We don't want to go any far above 15 degrees, otherwise it'll become runaway. And like I said, in reality, you won't be really looking at your angle of attack. You won't have that nice little information bar. So you'll be doing it by your speed. And we'll be controlling our angle of attack through the elevators to ensure that we keep a certain speed. So I think I've covered everything I wanted to say. Like I said, I've been waiting to get all this information in for ages. Feel free to make any corrections and stuff. I know stuff definitely about the airfoil, what I said probably wasn't completely correct. So let me know that. Next, we'll jump in the plane and put this to practice. So we've got our controls down at the bottom right, you can see there. If I wiggle the stick about, move the thrust and the rudder. So we're going to get into an imaginary dogfight. There's going to be a bad guy on the right-hand side here. We're going to turn into him and do a dogfight. Our power is always going to be set to maximum to take that out as a variable, so it becomes a constant. So first of all, we're going to go into this imaginary dogfight. We're not going to conserve and manage our alpha, and we're going to see what happens to us. It's going to be the inevitable. So in we go. There's the bad guy on our lift vector. Let's turn in. We yank back on that stick. Speed's decreasing. I should say at this point we can see our indicated airspeed. Do I have a cursor there? I do. There, 350 knots, and our alpha angle of attack there, 22 degrees at the moment, and the units, 32 units of alpha. Let's carry on. And that alpha is building up, and it's got unsustainable, and that's us basically in a stall at that point. The wings are no longer working properly. You can just see the alpha there, 30 something degrees, and alpha's got to 32 degrees. All of our speed is burnt off, and we're now basically screwed. We can keep turning. I mean, the only thing that's keeping us in the air at this point is the automated stability systems of this aircraft that stops us from basically flipping right over and going into a spin. But unfortunately, we can't fight like this. At 170 knots or whatever we are at, our aircraft just won't turn properly, and we'll be an absolute sitting duck. We've got no energy in the bird, and if I wanted to recover and get some speed back in the bird, unload, do an unloaded extension. It's taken all this time to get the energy back in the bird, and obviously I'd be dead by now because the guy would have shot me. So if I wanted to do that turn now but manage my angle of attack, put myself into the same turn. So I'm balancing the aft stick here to make sure my alpha doesn't get above about 15 degrees limit for this aircraft. And you can see I'm on 13 at the moment. And you can see my G there, about 7G. 6G, thereabouts, about right for the speed. That's how I could balance the angle of attack there, and in that case I would not run out of speed. I would keep going at the same airspeed basically until I ran out of gas or until we ended the dogfight. And we're going to try a similar thing now in straight flight. If we do a kind of mock landing, I'm just going to burn off my speed quickly. Okay, so I'm coming in for a landing, and I put my flaps down, my gear down. I'm going to let my speed get too low, my alpha get too high. These inversely proportional guys down here. Got our alpha there, and again our speed there. So we're coming into landing. My alpha is getting too high. We're starting to become a big air brake now. I'm having to increase the alpha even more. We're now slipping into a stall because we're getting so low, and the only way out of this is I'm not even going to allow myself burners. I'm going to just allow myself maximum mil power. Let's see if we can get out of this stall. We got out of it in the end. So that shows how in a straight line when landing we can over alpha, and I'm lucky because I've got a massively overpowered aircraft that's very lightweight at the moment. But if I was in a less powerful aircraft, I wouldn't be able to get out of that stall, and I will be going in the drink. Let's try that close to the ground now just for a bit of fun, shall we? Let's start getting a bit too slow. Alpha's going to start rising, 16 degrees, 20 degrees, 24, 25 degrees, Full back stick. Full power. Bosh, too late. We're with the fishes. So that just showed the same thing where we over-alphaed, and in this case we just didn't have enough vertical space to recover even though we went to full power. Right, that's all I've got to show. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll see you later.